in research. With us today, we have Professor Deborah Posel. I didn't even ask you if I'd pronounced your surname right.
It's correct. It's correct. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Prof Deborah is talking to us from Cape Town today. Professor Deborah Posel is a research professor at our own sociology department, and before that she was she's research professor at our sociology department. She was sociology professor and then also the founding director of the Institute for Humanities in Africa at UCT. She has written about many aspects of the history of apartheid and is currently working on a history of consumerism and its intersections with making of race in South Africa. This third seminar, Ethical Quandaries in Research, if I just can give a short little background. If we have to think of us in the social, human, and behavioral sciences and the humanities, as well as the arts, obviously, we are often working with human subjects, and we have to abide by certain ethical guidelines in our fields of study. And these guidelines basically define conditions as well as the limits for our research. The question is, what happens when these principles come into conflict with one another? How do we as researchers in the thick of the research project actually manage such conflicts? And what does this reveal about the relationship between professional and personal ethical principles? So Deborah is probably going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up the conversation. We're going to open up for questions. And thank you so much, participants, for joining the session. Please get your questions ready, and I do think that this is going to be a wonderfully lively conversation. Deborah Posel, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you, Shirley. Thanks very much, and hello to everybody. It's very nice to be here, although pity that we can't all see each other. I think we all long for the days where we can have a normal seminar discussion around a table. But let me begin straight away by picking up on something that Shirley mentioned in the beginning of her introductory remarks. I think it's true to say that in many parts of the world at the moment, including this country, this is a time of heightened ethical regulation and surveillance in research. I think that there are far greater expectations of our ethical accountability as social researchers now than would have been the case, say, 10, even maybe 5 years ago. So it's a change, and I think it has two sources, at least two sources probably. The first is institutional. I think that particularly in the United States, in recent years, many universities in their higher echelons, many research councils took steps to avert the risk of litigation from research subjects who felt themselves in one or other way to have been harmed. But there's also a political context, I think. In recent years, a much greater expectation that researchers should be sensitive to issues of power as they arise in the field. And in the last few years, in this sort of decolonial moment, particularly in relation to issues of race, as we well know. So, I mean, overall, I think this is a very good thing. I think, the regulation of our ethical conduct as researchers is a good thing, even though there might be some bureaucratic excesses at certain moments. But however good it is, I think it has been associated with a paradox. And the paradox is this. It arises from the fact that it is the issue of ethical clearance, getting the okay from the Research Ethics Committee, that has been uppermost in people's minds. especially when that process has become more onerous than it was in the past. Okay, how you just want to get the clearance and then get on with it, get into the field. And I think what that risks is that debates about the complexities of ethical issues as they arise during the actual practice of research, that series of debates has not been nearly as comprehensive or as honest as it ought to have been. I think the risk we face is a kind of tick box mentality, you know, where you need to check the paperwork, check to see that you've filled in all, you know, that we've filled in all the requirements of our various regulatory bodies, which may be very onerous. And at the end of the, you know, at the end of that, with great relief, we sort of dive into the research, and the question of ethics is maybe, you know, on some sort of a sidebar. So the tricky issues, the messy issues, I think get a lot less open discussion and honest debate because, paradoxically, because there is a greater expectation of ethical accountability. Yeah, very paradoxical. So my presentation is really, as Shirley was suggesting, it's about some of those messier issues, those ethical decisions that we are required to make during the course of our research that may actually be quite difficult to resolve. They may actually stop us in our research tracks without a clear sense of how to proceed. They may leave us a bit confused, uncertain, conflicted, or actually downright helpless in some instances. Okay, so the starting point for me in that discussion is the idea that the kind of decision making we will need to make as ethical social researchers in the actual field is situational. Okay, so it's about situational decision making. Now, for ethical philosophers, there is now a very well-established line of argument that our ethical lives, the practice of living, say, as an ethical human being, requires situational decision making. We have our ethical principles, we have our precepts, but in order to live according to those precepts, they need to be applied and in many instances adapted to particular situations. And it's that kind of judgment of how does a precept fit, what kind of adjustment is needed to a particular context, a particular space and time, that we live out as ethical subjects. I would argue that exactly the same situation pertains in social research. Okay, we have general ethical principles as social researchers. We get them from our disciplinary associations, from our universities, and other regulatory bodies. But these are general precepts, they are general guidelines, and therefore, by definition, they are abstracted from the specifics of a particular time or place. So when we go into the research field, we have to apply those precepts. But that application process will be shaped by the situations we find ourselves in. Okay, sometimes that application, that process of application may be completely straightforward, and those are the easy cases. But sometimes it isn't, and those are the tricky cases. And when it isn't, then those guidelines themselves may not help us. Because as Shirley alluded to in the beginning, sometimes one or two ethical precepts, both of which are binding on us, may nevertheless pull us in different directions. And if you think about your own particular discipline and the ethical guidelines that you work from, what you're presented with is a list. Okay, it's a list without a ranking. There's no hierarchy. This is number one, number two, whatever. So when two of those guidelines are in conflict, the guidelines themselves aren't going to help you resolve that conflict. We need to go beyond that in order to make the situational judgment that our ethical practice will require. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about situational ethical decision making in the field of social research. Okay, what are the kinds of quandaries that arise, and how might we go about putting them on the table and thinking them through? I'm going to be talking now on the strength of my own experience as a researcher, my own experience as a supervisor, because I think many of these issues arise in the course of supervision and the kinds of conversations that we need to have with our students in the field. But I'm also informed very much by a seminar series, which has now produced a book, which this is the book. It's called Ethical Quandaries in the Field of Social Research, which I co-edited with a colleague, Fiona Ross. And the book came about from the seminar series, and the seminar series emanated from a conversation that Fiona and I were having one day. Fiona, she's an anthropologist, but at that time she was also the chair of the Humanities Research Ethics Committee at UCT. And we happened to talk, we were talking about some research that we were each had been involved with, and we were talking about the kinds of messes, ethical messes that we had each gotten ourselves into. And then Fiona made the comment, she said, oh, wow, these are the kinds of things that the ethics committee never gets to hear about. And then we thought, well, actually, most people don't, because we don't openly discuss these kinds of issues. And so we decided to launch the seminar series, which created a forum for that kind of discussion. We invited our speakers to talk about their own experiences confronting difficult ethical conundrums that they had faced in the course of their own research. And we asked them what decisions they'd made and why, and whether now in retrospect they thought they had done the right thing or not. This, I have to say that this was one of the best seminar series that I'd ever organized, and I've organized many. And I think the reason for its success was that it operated in a space of dilemma rather than fully fledged argument. In other words, what I mean is that speakers were relaying a series of experiences that were not sort of neatly tied up. They were not fully resolved. There were a lot of loose ends about which they themselves still felt uncertain. And the seminar series created a kind of a safe space to be honest about the sorts of issues that were difficult to resolve. So what I'm hoping in the rest of this presentation is to open up that kind of space here. I don't have all the answers by any means to the kinds of questions that I'm going to be asking and the kinds of scenarios that I'm going to be sketching. It's not like that. I don't think anybody has all the answers. All of us are going to need to make our own personal judgments on the basis of our own ethical codes as individual human beings. Okay, so I think that probably the easiest way to start, what I hope will be a conversation with you, is to draw on a series of examples, some of which are anecdotes that I'm very familiar with, and then invite you, please, to share experiences of your own. All right, so let me start with what I think is perhaps the most common ethical challenge that we face in the field as social researchers, and that is managing in ethical ways a line between detachment and engagement. Our detachment from the field, from the lives of our research subjects, and our engagement or our involvement in those lives. And both the detachment and the engagement have ethical underpinnings, I think, albeit differently in different disciplines. So I think all disciplines in one way or another require a degree of detachment. Okay, we are under obligation as scholars to do our research with the kind of rigor and a degree of objectivity that scholarly research requires. Now, different disciplines will give a different gloss on that. Some of the social sciences will emphasize very much the scientificity of research, and set more store by greater orders of objectivity and detachment. Anthropologists, for example, tend to be much more immersed legitimately in the lives of their research subjects. But nevertheless, there is still an expectation that as a researcher, you can draw a line and you can step back, you can detach, so that when the time comes, you are able to make an independent judgment about your research subject matter, and that you don't get too drawn in, too sucked in to the lives of your research subject. On the other hand, you are also ethically impelled, obligated to see to it that your research doesn't inflict any harm. And for some, especially in some disciplines, that also impels you to act, if you can, to prevent harm in the field. Okay, now I know of several situations in which that has presented people with sometimes an intolerable dilemma. You may imagine that that kind of dilemma arises more frequently with qualitative research, when as qualitative researchers, we are much more drawn into the lives of our research participants. But don't imagine that quantitative researchers don't have that kind of issue as well. They do. So the example that I want to use here, I'm deliberately drawing from a case of quantitative research. And it's a chapter in the book, in our book. It's written by a team which was headed by Professor Lucy Kluwer, who's a professor of social policy at Oxford University. And she was leading a longitudinal study. Okay, so it had some qualitative dimensions, but the quantitative part was a longitudinal study of a series of issues related to the lives of what she called AIDS-affected children. Okay, and this was in several provinces in South Africa. And she was looking at the lives of AIDS-affected children in relatively marginal communities. Okay, and as you would imagine, what they encountered, what this team of researchers encountered, were situations, as we know, of deprivation, of suffering in many instances, some abuse, some neglect. So ideally, what we would expect as researchers is that when we encounter situations like that in the lives of our research subjects, that we step back, we refer those kinds of cases to various referral services, social workers, psychologists, various NGOs, perhaps. But what Lucy writes in her chapter is that in their case, they were working in many areas where those kinds of services were either completely overwhelmed or absolutely incompetent and unhelpful. So they felt that they had to intervene themselves. So they find themselves in situations where, for example, they started taking children to hospital, they started feeding some of the children, they started intervening to protect children from what they saw as potentially abusive relationships with adults. Okay, now that is, they felt that was their human obligation, but acknowledging that to some extent this was messing with the scholarly rigor of their research. When you're doing a quantitative longitudinal study, what you need to do is to measure a series of variables as they occur over a stretch of time. And you want to consider the kinds of changes or continuities that you discover as a consequence of your measurement. Now, if you as a scientist get involved, then to some extent, some of your measurements may be compromised. But as Lucy writes in the chapter, she says this is absolutely par for the course for everybody that she knows who is doing research in the field of AIDS in developing countries. Everybody knows that these kinds of issues arise. But interestingly, and she writes this in the chapter, I think quite bravely, she says this is not the sort of stuff that ever gets discussed, for example, in her department at Oxford or at an international AIDS conference. I'll read to you quickly what she says. She says, I wonder why at international AIDS conferences or meetings, I never mention this. There is a reason for every inaction as well as every action. And perhaps I prefer a conspiracy of acceptance to the potential for active debate. And what she's hinting at here is the fact that you don't want to upset your donors. You don't want to draw your university's attention to the fact that it's not so simple in the field. Okay, and of course, that's exactly why we are having this kind of conversation. Okay, that's one facet of how you manage the sort of insider-outsider boundary in research. Let me talk about another one, which I suspect many of you have also encountered, and that relates to the issue of power, because that insider-outsider boundary is completely entangled with differentials of power. Most of the time, when we talk about this, when we talk to each other or to our students, particularly in the light of the decolonial debates, we tend to emphasize our need to be sensitive to the power of the researcher relative to his or her research subject. We say a lot less about situations when the researcher is the weak one or the weaker one. And that is often the case, actually, particularly in the case of women, young women, but often older women too, who find themselves interviewing men who, in one or other way, give them a hard time, and sometimes dangerously so. I'm going to read you the first paragraph of another chapter from this book, written by Sindiso Mnisi Weeks, who is a legal scholar, a legal researcher who had done some work on customary law and chiefly authority in Southern Africa. She says her chapter is called Insider Outsider: Marriage Proposals, Advocacy, and Other Ethical Quandaries in Law and Society Research. She says, I have repeatedly found myself at the receiving end of marriage proposals to become a second or fifth wife. In 2 instances while I was conducting my PhD research, the self-perceived suitors were the effective gatekeepers of the research sites, people with the power to close down my access or severely compromise my acceptance. As a single woman at the time, both the options of rejecting and at least initially accepting their proposals presented grave risks of compromising my research. I realized that in one sense, I had brought the situation upon myself. I was an educated, accomplished Black woman who presented myself as very humble in the way I dressed, spoke, and conducted myself. She had been listening to those conversations about, be wary of your power as a researcher. This, I was later told by locals, is unheard of. I was perceived to be a rare commodity. While my intent in presenting myself as respectful and humble was that I should win greater access and acceptance, and I did, I was so successful that I was seen as a highly marriageable, even virginal young woman. And then she goes on in the course of the chapter to talk about how that issue unfolded and how at certain point, in respect of one of her projects, it got so tricky that she actually had to close the project down. And I suspect that often may arise, and we need to face up to that. However committed we may be to a certain course of research, there may come a point where that boundary between insider and outsider becomes unmanageable because we are unable to guarantee our own safety. And one of our ethical imperatives as social researchers is to protect ourselves from harm. But I'd be very interested to know whether any of you have had that experience or whether you find your students having that experience and you having to intervene to advise them. Okay, a third example, another instance perhaps of the insider-outsider kinds of conundrums that may arise, and that is the conflict between confidentiality in social research and the issue of harm, and where as a social researcher you stand when you see the potential or the risk of harm being enacted. We as social researchers are obligated to respect the confidentiality of our informants if that's what they request. That's our ethical obligation. Okay. But we are also obligated to do something in the event of harm unfolding before our very eyes. Now, that is sometimes extremely tricky, and perhaps most difficult for those of you who do research on, say, gangs or criminality. In those kinds of scenarios, you may often find yourself being drawn into the confidence of one of your informants, but that involves you being told, being privy to knowledge that something bad is going to happen. And then what do you do? Do you just sit with that knowledge and not say anything, and then to some extent become complicit? Or if you speak out, then you alienate your informant, and you maybe even put the project in jeopardy. I remember several years ago when I was at WITS, the Senate Research Ethics Committee wanted to introduce a rule, a guideline, that if any social researcher found themselves in a situation where some or other criminal act came to their attention, or the risk of a criminal act came to their attention, they had to inform the police or the authorities. And it produced an outcry in the Faculty of Humanities among people who said, if you do that, then there are a whole series of research projects that we simply can't do. And then others in the US who said, well, then you can't do that because they're not ethically accountable. So as far as I know, that was not resolved. How am I doing for time, Shirley? Have I got time for one more example?
Deborah, it is 26 minutes past. Yes, you do have time.
Okay. All right. Let me just choose one more example, and then I want to open it up. I want to hear about your experiences and whether this is ringing any bells for any of you. The last example, which I know many of my colleagues, and I've also found this tricky in many situations, involves the payment of our informants, giving some kind of compensation for people's time. Now, and this is also an issue, I think, that draws in something else that many of us are having to deal with increasingly, and that is the kind of ethical tensions that arise when scholars from the global north, who have their research cleared by their research committees overseas, come here and work in our field, so to speak, and where their practice may not necessarily be as we would have it. And in my experience, the issue of payment is one of those kinds of examples. So at the universities that I've been involved in, and you please tell me what's the case at Free State, there's a kind of discouragement, or at least a caution, about routinely paying your informants, either in the form of money or in the form of in kind, giving them some sort of a regular food parcel or something like that. And that's because you don't, the argument is that if you do that, then you sort of create a wish on the part of your informants to be obliging, to give you the kinds of answers that they think you want to hear. And there's a risk that it becomes a little bit manipulative in unintentional kinds of ways. So there's an active discouragement from doing that routinely. Although there is an understanding that sometimes it might be humanly required. Sometimes if you are going into a rather, into a sort of rather disadvantaged household, there isn't much in the household, and people want to host you generously and provide you with, tea or something. You can't go empty-handed. I mean, it would just be rude, frankly. So there's an acceptance, okay, occasionally, that's necessary. But there are many instances in which I know of, in which scholars have come from other countries in the world, with big fat research budgets and with no such qualms for some reason, and who have been willing to pay quite a lot of money sometimes for the time of their research informants. I'll give you a concrete example. There was a time a few years ago where I was one among many people working on aspects of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And at the time, it was a sort of almost like a cottage industry of research. There were, you know, the world was kind of infatuated with the TRC at one point, and there were any number of PhDs and books and research projects done on the TRC, which involved interviews with people who had in one or other way been involved with the commission. Not so much the commissioners, but sort of, you know, the on the ground, the rank and file kind of people. Some of whom, you know, partly as a joke, but partly seriously, started writing invoices for their time. They had invoice books, they had a rate, they had an hourly rate. And it was a you know, a not insubstantial rate, which was absolutely not our practice as researchers in the country. And also it was what we considered, you know, an inappropriate amount of money. And so it sort of messed things up for us a bit, because obviously people were much more inclined to be interviewed by those people who could pay them. Okay, so I don't know the answer, what is right or wrong in that instance, as in relation to many of the instances that I've spoken about. But I want to stop now, and I'm very much I'd like to open it up, and I'm very interested to hear whether what I've been saying resonates. If it doesn't, do tell me. If it does, I'm fascinated to hear about your own experiences and how they do and don't compare.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Appreciate. Colleagues, attendees, please don't be shy to put on your camera and ask your question.
You don't have to put on your camera if you don't feel it. But it would be nice. But otherwise, just your voice. Well, while we're waiting, Shirley, maybe you can tell me, does any of this resonate for you? You were telling me before the session about your own research.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know whether this is stuff that you've had to deal with.
Deborah, I tell you, so as a researcher, everything that you have said resonates with me. Absolutely. I've encountered situations where I had to balance my detachment and my engagement. The issue of power, it would seem that I'm also quite an eligible marriage partner, preferential marriage partner, I suppose, for some.
Yeah.
Yes, so I've had a number of marriage proposals out in the field as well. I've also found myself in a number of situations where men actually made passes at me, you know, and that is something that is always a difficult thing to negotiate, you know, in our everyday lives, but in our research lives in the field.
What did you do? How did you manage it?
Okay, so I tell you what, fortunately I speak Sesotho, so you know, I had a conversation with the guys that made the passes, and the other thing is fortunately other research participants at the community were very protective of me as well, and would almost chastise some of these guys, you know, for don't be silly, you know, she's out and things like that. Yeah.
But have you found yourself in a situation where perhaps one of your students or field workers has been in a more dangerous situation? Because I think that has been happening, and at some universities I think has provoked a kind of very concerned but also quite uncertain situation of how to protect those students, you know, without wanting to erode their independence in the field, but how to protect them. And I don't know, is that discussion happening at UFS?
I tell you, Deborah, so when it came to the formulation or the reworking of the ethics policy framework, that was something that we from Humanities felt quite strongly about, and we had asked that such a clause be included. From Humanities' side, I don't think that we have an absolute answer yet, but at least what we wanted to do is to make the research fraternity, at least at the university, aware of the fact that the power differential is not always researcher in power, but actually researcher in the subordinate position.
Right.
And how, what do we do as researcher, as supervisors, as the institution, to protect our students in particular? What do we do? So I would hate to actually put some people on the spot, but I know that some people are in this conversation. I think you know who you are. Please, won't you also share some of the, some thoughts that we've spoken about, and that we've perhaps spoken that you speak about with your students about protecting themselves. In our honors seminar, in our honors class, we actually have a conversation about that, alerting the students to the fact that they should be aware of their own safety as well.
Can I ask you then, I see that there's not, we're waiting for people to respond. So let me ask you, because I know different, maybe different universities have different positions on,
yes,
on the kinds of boundary challenges that I was talking about. So, how would your research, I know you chair, don't you, the Research Ethics Committee. How would you feel if you discovered that, social researchers in the faculty were becoming quite involved in the lives of their research subjects? I'll give you an example of something that happened to me. The one I chose in my presentation, I deliberately wanted to choose from somebody who was a quantitative researcher. I do qualitative research, and I found myself, when I was with it, I was in a team of people, and I was a doctor, a public health specialist, and we were working with field workers up in Mpumalanga, and we were doing some research on experiences of death, actually on death and dying, and this was before the rollout of ARTs. And we were interested to know how people made sense of the fact that the wrong people, right? Okay, young people in large numbers were dying, as opposed to the previously normal pattern of death, which would have been mostly older people. And one of the women, the young women that we were working with, she was HIV positive, but she felt she could not tell her family. But she told the field worker in this project, and let's just call her Tsipo at this point, or Gift. I'm going to call her Gift, right? Umpo, yeah. So Umpo developed quite a close relationship with this woman, who, although her family was very close to her, she felt she just couldn't tell her family. But she was not well. She really wasn't well. Her family had taken her to various kinds of healers who'd given her various kinds of treatments, but she wasn't getting better. And one day, Mpho went to see her, and she found that this woman had collapsed on the floor. She wasn't entirely conscious. She was really ill. And then so the field worker phoned me and said, "What does she do now?" I was in Joburg at the time. And like I probably thought about it for about 2 minutes, because I thought, oi, this is not what you should be doing as a social researcher, is taking your research subjects to hospital, especially when they've got a family nearby. And so it was a very, very loving, committed family. but they didn't know about the HIV. And we knew that as soon as she went to hospital, that would be disclosed. So it didn't take long, but we decided, okay, take her to hospital. Don't tell her family, because that's what she preferred. And of course, when she got to hospital, she was put on treatment. And then that treatment became her secret and our secret. And it meant that throughout the duration of the project, we were the ones taking her to hospital for her treatment, which was well beyond the kind of boundary that, we had normally expected her. And in my chapter in the book, I kind of write about many dilemmas that we got into as a consequence of that complicity with her secret.
Right.
So I'm curious to know, would you have done the same thing?
I would have done exactly the same thing, Deborah. I would have responded as a human being to a human being, and if someone collapsed, I would be concerned about their welfare. Pietru, sorry, Deborah, before we continue there, Pietru, please go ahead. You have a comment.
Okay. Thanks, Deborah. So far, I appreciate basically everything that you said. Although I just have two ideas or comments to throw into the conversation, and that is, yes, definitely, I think from an anthropological point of view, we are almost first and foremost thinking of ourselves as human beings and identifying almost with whatever we encounter in the field, except now if it is negative, or as Shirley said, some of the guys coming on to you, and yeah, that's different. But even then, you try to treat it or resolve the situation in such a way that the person doesn't lose face. So again, it's with humanness behind everything that you are doing. My biggest challenge at the moment when we teach and supervise students is really to, for me, this ethical is exactly situation is as you explained. You have on the one hand the more formal administrative kind of tick the boxes, but what we need to teach our students or let them get a framework of their own value system in the field is to guide them towards which values they should uphold um, that will still preserve their own integrity as well as those of their participants. So for me, to go to that step where you are saying go behind the guidelines. So it's one thing to have a set of guidelines like these examples that you spoke about are all part of our guidelines, so to speak, that we will send our students with into the field. But it's more challenging when we are talking about the values behind those, or I'm talking now, I'm calling it values, but maybe it's not necessarily that strict. But you know what I'm thinking. For instance, say for to say I uphold the value of ongoing negotiation. So instead of just getting consent once, or making a undertaking of not doing harm, I will continuously try to check on myself and reflect and work it through and with my participants, key participants. It's those that I value their perspectives of. Another thing that I just want to mention is that I think it's always valuable to, especially if you are relatively inexperienced, to make use of a research guide. So I had the fortunate experience to work in Lesotho in very early days of my venturing out into research, and a local lady who worked for agriculture was my guide, and she walked literally every day with me, went with me to all my interviews. So she didn't interfere, but she was there in case something happens or I'm not sure how to act in a certain situation. So that would be my advice always, to say make use of local guides that could help you at least with the local ethics and ethical decision making that you have to take almost unexpectedly every day. Oh, that's it. Thank you.
Can I respond to that, Shirley?
Please do.
Yeah.
Do.
So thank you. You said many things. I'll respond to many aspects of what you say, but just on the issue of what you're calling a guide, which may also be, a field worker from a community may perform a similar kind of role, a sort of not only a sort of cultural translator, in the sense that somebody who can kind of tell you what is an appropriate action, inaction, intervention, non-intervention. I've had that experience, but actually where the field worker and I have disagreed on what is the kind of ethically appropriate thing to do. And that's also a tricky one. She's closer to the community, but I'm in a position of authority. And I found that was a tricky one to negotiate, because sometimes our scholarly expertise does and must count for something. We are the researchers. And I don't think, we can be sensitive to power differentials. We must do that. But at the end of the day, we also have to exercise our own scholarly responsibility. So that is in itself a power differential sometimes that can be challenging to negotiate. But on the issue of informed consent and renegotiating informed consent, if you look at the most recent ethical guidelines of the American Anthropological Association, you'll see they're very clear about, as a precept, that informed consent should be negotiated and renegotiated throughout the course of the research. And I think that that's become quite widely accepted as a desideratum. It's, of course, much more tricky to implement, particularly if you reach a case, and I'm thinking of a case of a colleague, where at a certain point, quite far down the line, somebody withdrew their consent. And then, of course, you are obliged to, despite having invested lots of time with that person, you are obliged to, set aside all the material that would have been forthcoming from that person. But I clearly gave examples that didn't generate enough sense of discomfort, although I think they are very discomforting. But let me ask you then this question: do you think it's okay? And this has again happened in cases that I know about. Do you think it's okay for researchers to lend their research subjects money? Now, if we've been saying up until now that, you want to act ethically as a human being. Maybe your research subject is in a bad way, just needs a bit of money to tide him or her over. Is it okay?
Deborah, Joy, would you like to take that question? Since you have a meme.
Sorry, man. It's just because I'm listening to Deborah and I'm thinking about the conversations that I've had, particularly with my first year students. And so in some ways I have to preempt that meme on the side there by saying the following, that to me, ethics is not something that you apply or think of at the level of the research proposal. You're thinking about it throughout. So the start of your kind of inquiry in terms of your research area and your research question, the ethical situation that you find yourself in, even prior to going into the field as if it is separate from your life, you're thinking about those ethics. And I think I found what Deborah said earlier in terms of the ethical subject extremely important. So even as Deborah talks about the distinction between the researcher and the researched, and that there are power differentials there, and that you have a responsibility as the researcher to your discipline, and as well to disciplinary ethic codes, faculty codes of ethics, university codes of ethics, etc. I find it much harder to make that distinction between the researcher and researched. And that, of course, is based on my particular positioning in South Africa, but also a kind of ethical conundrum, which I think Deborah hinted to in terms of the lawyer there, with regard to my own research participants in Muizenberg. And that was a couple of years back, where at the time GBV was getting, there was a swell in the kind of discussion around that, and particularly rape as a weapon against South African women. And I remember innocuously standing, just watching a group of people mourning because a Congolese man had passed. And a Congolese acquaintance came across to me and said, you're so beautiful, I can just rape you. And in that moment, I was like, all the kinds of swear words that could possibly went through my head at that point. And I remember thinking the only way I can get him away from me is if I actually swear him. Because at that point, I understood that for a number of Congolese men and women, in order to be seen as a woman, you had to be submissive, you had to be respectful. So Congolese women didn't swear, right? So I kind of went, well, if you, I swore at him. But in the process, I supported a stereotype that existed in that area, in that time, about colored women, right? Because externally, I looked like somebody who was colored. And when Congolese men would approach me, also marriage proposals and stuff, I would be told, but you're a colored woman. So I was responding to him based on the circumstances and the context. So exactly what Deborah spoke about there in terms of situational ethics. But I was also very aware in that moment that because of my training, I had been convinced that I was powerful as the researcher. And in that moment, I came to understand that I'm not. That I'm a human being engaging with a human being, right? And so that relationship had to be engaged with in that particular moment, and also thereafter when I met up with them and had other kinds of interactions. So I became very aware that this idea that somehow this ethical code of conduct provides you with a level of protection as the researcher, in terms of protecting your research participants, was actually a fallacy. And that we don't go around asking our research participants to sign ethical codes of conduct, right? So there's vulnerability in the field, and it's often, I think, ignored by virtue of the discussion around ethics. So that meme for me became important because it talks about the distinction. So let me just read this for you quickly. I'm taking a little bit long here, but forgive me.
Go ahead.
The single biggest thing I learned was from an Indigenous elder of Cherokee descent, Stan Rushworth, who reminded me of the difference between a Western settler mindset of I have rights and an Indigenous mindset of I have obligations. Instead of thinking that I am born with rights, I choose to think that I am born with obligations to serve past, present, and future generations and the planet herself. And so I often, when I speak to my students, I say, look, you've got this ethical code of conduct, but you need to remember that it lives, it breathes every time you have an interaction with your research participants. And if that is longitudinal, as what happens in anthropology, it's a living document in inverted commas. It's a breathing, living, in situ, situational process that is not finite. So once you leave the field, you still have ethical obligations to those you worked with when you write. And every time you do a conference presentation, you still have obligations. Every time you choose to write about your research, those obligations are extended. So to me, it's not a finite process. Ethical conundrums and quandaries are, yeah.
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 Yeah. No, I hear you, Joy, and I absolutely agree that ideally, of course, those ethical conversations should be current throughout the research process. But you were saying some other things too, and I'd like to sort of put on the table the other side, perhaps. I mean, you've spoken very eloquently about, the fact, of course, we don't shed our social skin when we enter the field. We enter the field as, as members of communities, as gendered, as raced, as all of that. And we have degrees of proximity or distance from the people we're researching, right? And as you say, it kind of impacts, it makes itself felt, and that's inevitable and that's human. And I suspect that we spend much more time talking now about what are our ethical obligations under those kinds of conditions when we have those kinds of affinities, right? But I also think we need to talk a bit more and a bit more honestly about what are our ethical obligations to our disciplines. What are our ethical obligations to our funders? What are our ethical obligations to the scientific or the scholarly, I don't want to use the word science because it's just a bit too contested, but to our scholarly practice, which is a way of raising the questions of the limits of that kind of immersion. And what are the points at which we need to pull back? So maybe I can make this concrete. In the case of you, right, the Congolese guy who kind of hits on you, you obviously were able to manage it, but there was a moment in which you felt it wasn't so cool, it wasn't so safe. What would be your ethical obligation if you found yourself in a situation where your own safety was compromised?
Deborah, if I can ask you, maybe just elaborate a little bit there in terms of the reference to the, to the discipline or scholarly praxis, because I think, to me, I mean, a kind of a knee-jerk reaction would be that your safety is of paramount importance in that moment, you know. And when you recognize that who you are as a titled person, so not the, I love that, not as the social skin, but as the title that's been given to you as a researcher, when you realize that that doesn't have value in that moment, to me, it would be, my allegiance should be to making sure I save my own skin.
No, absolutely. Your physical skin too. No, absolutely. And then perhaps that's an easy example, because actually your scientific obligation would be to do exactly that. And actually your scientific obligation is not to conduct research that puts yourself at risk, no matter how tempting it might be to pursue it. And that might sound paradoxical, but actually I know of instances where students, for example, have been so hell-bent on research because they think, oh, I'm on the verge of something really, really interesting. But in fact, I was a member of a supervisory committee. We decided, no, you actually can't do that. You actually can't do this research. This was several years ago in Johannesburg. It was somebody who wanted to do research on the emergence of rave culture And she found herself, we were completely unaware of actually how the emergence of rave culture was entangled with organized crime and drug syndicates and blah, blah, blah. And she found herself having her computer stolen, her tires slashed, you know, and although she had registered for the PhD and it was all sorted, the proposal accepted, we actually decided that we had to stop it. And that, funnily enough, was as much a scholarly decision, a scholarly ethical decision, as it was a human one. Okay, so that's one facet of scholarly practice. I think to emphasize that scholarship actually sets a premium on the safety of the researcher. But the other issue is the sort of perhaps the more the trickier one, because perhaps we all think it's obvious that we should remain safe as researchers. I just want to emphasize that that's a professional ethical imperative too. The question of detachment and the point at which actually we have a responsibility to be somewhat objective, somewhat independent, somewhat critical, and somewhat detached. I sometimes think we don't talk enough about that. And that's what I mean by our scholarly ethical imperatives. We are not the friends of our research informants. We are not. We are researchers, and there's a difference. We're not therapists for our research subjects. We are researchers, even though we might find ourselves in situations where that's what they want from us. We have to formulate a relationship which is supportive and compassionate and caring, but around which we draw certain kinds of lines. And I wonder if we talk enough about what those lines are.
Deborah, if I may, because I think, and sorry, Shirley, I'm just jumping in here. I think probably in anthropology there's a huge section, I think, in respect of relationships in the field. So I think of a compendium called Bridges to Humanity. Another text like The Shadow Side of Fieldwork as well. And these are texts probably 15 years or older already. So this kind of conversation, I think, has been happening in anthropology, particularly because people realize that the level of immersion is so deep that we can't actually continue to say that we are objective. So for me, the question becomes, where do we start to move towards objectivity? And often, of course, that's in our writing, I think. Because then you have to go through a process of extraction. I think of it in terms of my own fieldwork, and I think, well, that's when you turn to the literature. That's how you become, you practice your scholarship, because you start to look at your data through that which you've read. And that allows you in some ways to extract yourself from the field. But I know for me, it took an extremely long time, because the people I worked with did become family. They weren't just research participants or research friends, but they became family. They became like my brothers. Mm-hmm. And that was confirmed when one asked me to be the godson of his son. So I understand what happened there. I also recognize the kind of critical lens that I had to take on, and how difficult it was to do so, because I was talking about my family. And even now, I'm still talking about my family, So that level of immersion, extraction, subjectivity, objectivity, I think it's probably related to the discipline itself and what it has allowed over the past 10 to 20 years in terms of, the people who embody that discipline. So it might be very different, I'd think, for somebody who does politics, for example, who does history. you know. But definitely, I think over the past 10, 20, even 30, 40 years, that conversation's been happening in anthropology. And so the push is not necessarily towards saying we're completely subjective, but it's definitely a recognition that objectivity in and of itself is questioned.
Thanks, Joy. I see there's somebody, there's a question, so I'm hoping to draw somebody else into the conversation.
I'm trying to draw the people into the conversation, Deborah.
Christian, there's somebody, Christian. Yeah, Christian. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you, Deborah, for your presentation. This is really fascinating, and I look forward to looking at your edited volume. My question and comments relate to confidentiality and the issue of harm.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in how you framed that issue in the context of research on gangs and criminality, and in a context in which you know, or you have strong reason to believe that something bad is going to happen, and in which confidentiality is an ethic that you're trying to protect. My research also engages with confidentiality and the issue of harm, but in that case, I'd say harm is much more ambiguous, mm-hmm. and confidentiality/anonymity is in question. I work with exiles and histories of exile, and harm is ambiguous because when people bring up politically controversial histories, whether that might come back to the research participants is often very ambiguous, perhaps even unlikely, but possible. But many of my research participants and many others who work in this field, the research participants very much want their names on the paper, because having the name there is part of being recognized historically and so on. And I'm wondering, I guess, how does your volume engage with the issue of confidentiality and harm beyond the context that you brought up, and how do you see the manner in which research committees generally work with confidentiality/anonymity issues? In my opinion, there's a knee-jerk reaction very frequently in the research committees that, well, to be ethical is to protect confidentiality. I entirely agree that is a crucial conversation to have with every research participant, but in my field of study, I find that very frequently people want their names there, and often I'm convinced that some scholars are not even giving the space for that, because it might come against what a research committee, it runs against the grain of a norm among research ethics committees. So that's my series of comments and questions.
Thank you. So, firstly, in relation to the book is not comprehensive. It doesn't sort of pretend to cover every sort of ethical eventuality. It's just a series of stories from a range of researchers, and that particular issue, I'm trying to think. It doesn't. There isn't somebody in this book, if I remember correctly, who wasn't doing the kind of research which animated that very particular dilemma. But I do know people who've done research on gangs, for example, where they did find themselves in a very tricky situation. And I found myself in a situation, that same project I was talking about before, the one on death and dying. I mean, thank goodness this resolved itself, but there was a day, a very difficult day, where we knew that one of our research subjects told a field worker that she wanted to kill somebody in the community. I think she was quite mentally unstable, and we knew that, but she had told her as a sort in a confessional sort of way, like not to tell anybody. And as I say, thankfully it resolved itself, and somebody else got to discover, and the woman was actually hospitalized because she did actually need treatment. But I know that a comparable kind of situation very often arises if you're working, in a sort of, if the issue of gangs is your research field. But on the question of anonymity / confidentiality, the first thing that I would want to stress is that those are different, and I think they often get conflated. So I think my understanding is that our ethical obligation is to honor anonymity if that is at the request of our research subjects. I don't think we are compelled to conceal their identity if it's their preference that they be named. But I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong. I've certainly, there are times when I've interviewed people and they've not only been happy to have their identities revealed, but have actually requested, as in the case you cite too, they have requested to be named because they want to be associated with a particular line of argument. And my understanding is that there's nothing in our code of ethics that prevents that process of naming and identification. Confidentiality, see, as I understand it, is not about naming. It's about if somebody with whom we're developing a relationship, a research subject, says, I'm going to tell you something, but it's off the record. I'm going to tell you something, but you have to keep it a secret. And often complexly a secret, because you can't, they don't want you to tell another research subject with whom you also have a relationship. So then you get kind of drawn into configurations of disclosure, non-disclosure, secrecy, openness, whatever, in more complicated ways. But I think the obligation to confidentiality is different from anonymity, but that is also, it seems to me, at the behest of our research subjects. It's if they ask us, when they say this is off the record, then it must be off the record. We don't have, it's not our prerogative to use something if somebody said to us that we can't. I mean, that's my understanding of the issue, and I don't know of any scenario where ethical committees have not sort of thought likewise on that matter. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. I guess my my only follow-up is that the argument makes sense. Sometimes I feel like the issue isn't even raised, at least in my experience at UFS and some conversations I've had regarding anonymity. It's as if ethical research equals anonymity, and there's no conversation about the conversation that one should have with research participants. I'm not saying that that's the norm across the university. I'm just saying that it seems like even though in principle that research ethics committees that I've come across agree with these points that you're making, that in practice sometimes that issue isn't even raised, and and that's part of why I wanted to bring it up.
Well, thanks for doing that, because it should be raised. I mean, I recently did a piece of research where the people who were party to that research saw the research as a way of publicizing their position, and that's exactly what they wanted, and that's actually why they participated in the research. That was their sort of interest. But just on the question of anonymity, I mean, anonymity, I think it bears saying that anonymity is sometimes quite difficult to achieve. So I mean, do you remember that, or some of you may not know, there was a sort of a study done in the 1950s. It was a sociological study. Okay, so if the anthropologists among you may not have heard about it, but it was a very famous study for raising all kinds of very difficult ethical issues. It was by a man called Lord Humphreys. But that's L-A-U-D, not L-O-R-D, Lord Humphreys, and it was called The Tea Room Trade. And it was about, it was a sort of ethnography of male public toilets in a small town in America. I mean, this was in the 1950s, McCarthyite era, when homophobia was kind of rampant and an absolutely virulent kind of repression, refusal to engage in any discussions, open discussions about same-sex practices. Anyway, this guy did research in public toilets and sort of revealed that there was a lot of sexual exchange going on in the public toilets, and that many of the men who were party to those sexual encounters were themselves heterosexual men, and he knew them. This was a sort of small town America. And then, so when he published the book, which he did, he didn't use people's names, but he sort of gave slight descriptions of people. He thought that was insufficient to identify people, but actually what happened is that this community pored over that book. They sort of devoured the book with great disgust and disopprobrium, and sort of managed to identify, sort of went to great lengths to say, who's this person, who's that person. And they destroyed the lives of those people who had been party to that research. So it sort of did animate the difficulty sometimes in anonymity. And so if you are doing that kind of research in that sort of place, a small place where many people know each other, that's why sometimes people resort to this sort of fiction of not naming the place that they're working in. So I don't know if some of the anthropologists among you know about that book by Victor Crapanzano called Waiting, which is an ethnography. It was actually undertaken in Franschhoek, and the participants were anonymous. But again, that was an instance where he felt that he was at risk of exposing his informants. So he didn't name Franschhoek. He just sort of fudged it and sort of tried to describe the kind of place that he was working in. And there's also something very unsatisfactory about that. Sometimes you need to know about the place. You need to know, where is this person working? And of course, what happened was that people eventually worked it out. And then same story. Some of the people who are identified in the book can probably be named because there isn't a sufficient of a disguise, perhaps, although nothing in that particular study would necessarily have messed up their lives. But they may have been associated with saying things that they didn't want to have put in the public domain. So again, I don't think anonymity is necessarily simple.
Thanks so much, Deborah. I wanted to put a question to you and the rest of the participants, please. I think we could call this a roundtable discussion now.
Yeah, good.
And I was wondering the impact that the POPIA Act, the personal information, the Sharing of Personal Information Act would have on perhaps our ideas of confidentiality and anonymity.
Well, just spell it out, Shirley. That's an interesting question. Tell me a bit more about the details of the Act. You may know more about it than I do, the sort of grittiness of it.
Okay, so I certainly am no expert at this point in time. I attended a webinar the other day. Professor Sekwacha, I believe, is in this meeting. Mamelo, so I don't know if you want to say something about that, but in any case, the POPIA Act is the Protection of Personal Information Act. And what is going to happen is that all of our research, we are going to have to consider this extra layer, since we're talking about confidentiality and anonymity. In the type of social science research that we do, where sometimes it can be deduced where the place is, and sometimes even who the people are, particularly when your research participants are actually wanting to be named. And I actually posed that question the other day in that webinar. I haven't received an answer on that, but perhaps I thought, since this is an extra layer of dilemma that we might be confronted with, at least going forward, because this act is must be implemented. I believe it's from July going forward. Yeah.
Well, let me respond by just adding something that I think complicates it even more. I don't think the discussion. I spent a year at UCL, sort of about 2 years ago now, and there was a debate that was raging there actually about ethics in relation to the question of open access. Okay, now their progress with open access is more advanced than we are here, but we're going to get there to the same place. And I think it pulls in the opposite direction from this legislation in interesting ways and confusing ways, actually. So the debate, so the sort of, I mean, open access on one level sounds like, you know, wow, it sounds like, of course, it's a good thing. Everybody should have open access. But actually, the requirements are, at least in the way that they were talking about them at UCL, I had real trouble with, because their understanding of open access is that you deposit all your research materials. So let's say you write an article and you draw on a series of interviews. The transcripts of those interviews should be made available. Okay, everything that you use to come to the conclusions that you do in the article should be made available. Now, you know, you may not necessarily want to put the entire transcript there, because you may use that interview very judiciously and very selectively to conceal some things and to foreground other things. Yeah, you want to be the one. You want to be the gatekeeper in relation to your own material, because you are the one who has made a series of undertakings to your research subjects, right? But the open access imperative is kind of pulling in another direction. It's like, you know, you did the research, hand it over, kind of thing. So I think that's an extreme, but, you know, and it also, it's complicated by the legal requirements of legislation like this. I don't know the details of it, so you know, I'm speaking subject to correction, but I suspect we are all going to have to find out about it with much greater precision, because it is going to affect the way we manage information and who has access. When we write something down, you know, when we make field notes, you know, who's entitled to see that? Are we entitled to keep some of our own interviews and some of our own field notes secret if we want to, because we think that that honors best the undertakings we've made to our subjects? Yeah. On the other hand, at what point can they demand that we retract something? I mean, this is another facet of the ongoing nature of informed consent. I mean, you know, we do also undertake, I hope, that we don't go into print quoting from an interview with somebody until they've approved that. And I suspect many people are not doing that. And with legislation like this, you know, somebody might actually one day take it up. But you know, it's not a satisfactory answer, but I just think that the issue of open access is going to complicate your question even more. That's really what I wanted to say.
You know, so Deborah, with about 5 minutes to go, and the rest of the panel, the rest of the participants, I was wondering if there are perhaps questions. Some of our participants work, and I'm talking about participants now as in not research participants, but participants in this webinar. are working in social health research, Africa studies, and I'm wondering, because I see our psychologists have left now, I'm wondering if there are any questions from their side or something that you could think of, Deborah, that might be relevant sort of towards the end of this discussion.
Well, ideally, I'd like to hear from them.
I'm inviting them.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of understand that sometimes it's, you know, these kinds, if people have had, look, some people may not have had ethically complicated decisions to make, and that's fair enough. Not everybody does. And others may have had to make decisions they found difficult and maybe don't want to talk about them. I understand both of those things. But I do, you know, I want to, I suppose, come back to something that was implicit in my exchange with Joy, and to underline actually that there are differences between disciplines in the expectations of what is ethically appropriate, what's pushing the boundary, what's going too far, you know, or what's not. So, you know, I do think that what an anthropologist considers ethically legitimate may well be what a public health specialist thinks isn't, and vice versa sometimes. Because it may well be that a public health person, you know, in the name of a commitment to health and the promotion of health, may want to intervene in ways that an anthropologist thinks, for example, is inappropriate. You know, so for example, there may well be some quite intense disagreements between public health and anthropology about issues, for example, of, say, indigenous medicine, and how to manage a situation where, you know, for a public health person, what's going on is harmful. Whereas for an anthropologist, what's going on is culturally specific. So I suppose rather than perhaps invoke a dilemma, I would just like to remind us that, you know, what we're dealing with in many instances is the specifications of a discipline and a particular community of practice, because that actually ultimately is what a discipline is. And those communities of practice have, you know, a series of norms and expectations that are often discipline specific. And the ethical clearance process is about satisfying the norms of the discipline. So for people who kind of push and pull against the yoke of the discipline, you know, that might be another site of tension. But it also means that the process of regulation by an ethics committee, you know, a faculty ethics committee or a university ethics committee, is going to need to take that into account. That you know, ethical regulation is actually not a one-size-fits-all. And you know, we all know it's a sort of very familiar debate now that we in the humanities and social sciences don't want to have a biomedical model imposed on us, because you know, that's not the way our disciplines work. And I think a lot of the debate about ethics, certainly in the States and increasingly in this country too, is about trying to, you know, give more power, more institutional authority to the position emanating from the humanities and social sciences, and to sort of keep the biomedical position in its own box, rather than to allow it to become hegemonic across all the disciplines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for that, Deborah. Mamelo, I see your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Shelley and colleagues. Good afternoon. I just maybe wanted to comment quite briefly on the POPIA Act and how that will affect our research activities. You know, the involvement of the RECs, the multiple layers that you mentioned quite earlier, and how that will really affect open access. it is not clear at the moment as how that would unfold. But what we know that the POPIA Act applies to many different settings that involve the use of personal information. But within the research setting, we know that it intends to regulate the processing of personal information for research purposes. So the implication it will have on research activities that involve collection of data and processing of that data. We know that even storage of that data. I mean, we have had inquiries. Personally, I have inquiries from many researchers and disciplines as well to say, what are the guidelines in terms of archiving and storage of data, personal data. And so we found that our response was not adequate to only be based on the current DOH guidelines, and also the other guidelines, be the GCP for the biomedical discipline, but that our response, even on archiving alone and storage and data sharing, had to incorporate the POPIA Act or the provisions of the POPIA Act. And in so many instances, you find that the provisions do not only relate to research. So one has to extract what is relevant and what is not. But I think the bigger picture, or rather the comprehensive understanding of how the POPIA would affect research, and its main aim, I think, is to regulate that processing of information more across the borders of South Africa, to ensure that any limitations on the right, I think the idea is to protect the rights and the privacy of people, and to say that whatever data is shared, particularly personal information data, that is fully justified. So the aim would be alongside of protecting the rights and interests of people. We don't know in terms of the simple ethical guidelines in terms of publishing, just being keeping confidentiality and anonymization, how that will then affect the current practice. In the webinar that was held by ASAF that you referred to, it was just so unfortunate that participants were for some reason unmuted. So I think I even shared in the chat box to say that the decisions on the participation of RECs has not been made. We are yet to meet with ASAF on the 13th of May. And it is from that we will see what can be done by the ethics committee, what is really within their responsibilities, and what will be the responsibilities of the institution, because most of it really falls within the institutions and the information officers. So don't be alarmed by what was said in the webinar. Most of it is still to be cleared out. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mamelo. Appreciate that clarification also. My dogs are getting louder and louder on this side. Apologies for that. Friends, we are, it's past our hour and a half mark. And Deborah, I don't know, do you perhaps have a final word or so that you would like to share?
No, I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. From my side, then, I would like to thank you very, very much for availing yourself for this conversation. I am fascinated. I think this is an important conversation that we should continue to have. So I'm very excited about this. So thank you for all of the participants and the discussion during this session as well. As we end off, I would just like to remind everyone that our next webinar is on Friday, the 21st of May. And the title of that webinar is Research Ethics in the 21st Century, the Role of the Humanities. So I do believe that this has been a precursor for a conversation that is going to be happening on the 21st. And I think that important foundational conversations and work has been done in this discussion, in this conversation. So colleagues, students that are attending, thank you. For everyone else, and particularly Deborah, I think that we are going to have a number of other conversations, perhaps on the side. But I thank you so much for your insights and your questions, for getting us thinking about these significant quandaries that we encounter in the field. So thank you so much, and wishing you all a beautiful Wednesday further. So thank you so much. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.